In this tutorial, I'll demonstrate how to create a weblog with user commenting, and even with explaining everything clearly, it should only take about 20 minutes. This tutorial uses the assets that were created in the introductory tutorial, so if you haven't watched that yet, it would be good to do so. The first thing I have to do is create a database, so I'll use a desktop application to accomplish this, but you can use phpMyAdmin, the command line, or whatever your preferred utility is for database management. I'll create a database and name it blog, and I'll add a table and name it entries. Our ID field, I want to change the type to auto increment so that it will increment with each entry. We also need to add a title field. And we need a content field for the weblog entry information. I'll call this field body and make it of the text type. Now, if I were doing this for a real site, I'd probably add a date field, an author field, and a few other things, but for this demonstration, I'll keep it simple with just a title and a body field. So now we need to tell CodeIgniter to connect to the database we just created. To do that, I'll go to the config folder and open our database file. Within this file, it allows us to store our database connectivity settings. You'll see in the array host name, username, password, and database. Now, the database we just created is blog, so I'll key this in here and save it. Now, we've saved that setting in the file, but CodeIgniter will not automatically connect to our database. It doesn't assume that you necessarily need database access, so we need to tell it that we do by making use of the autoload file, also in the config folder. This file lets us specify classes, helper files, plugins, and other resources that we want loaded automatically every time the system runs. So I'll open the file, and within the core array, I'll add database since it happens to be a core library. Now if we go to our front controller, index.php, the fact that I'm not seeing an error message tells me that we've successfully connected to our database. Obviously, we're still seeing the information that we generated during our introductory tutorial, the to-do list that we created, but in a moment I'll replace this with our actual blog information. What I want to do first, though, is to add some information to the database so we have some data to work with. To do that, I'd like to use the scaffolding feature. CodeIgniter has a scaffolding feature that makes it very convenient to add information to your database. So let's go to the controller that we created last time, and within the constructor, I'll load the scaffolding feature. And we need to tell it the database table that we want to scaffold, and since our table was called entries, I'll use that as the parameter. Before we can actually use our scaffolding feature, we need to go back to our config folder and open the routes file. You'll recall that this is where we set our default controller in the first tutorial. It also lets us set a secret word that will trigger the scaffolding feature for added security. I'll just use scaffolding here. Now that that's set and we have our scaffolding feature loaded into our blog controller, I'll go to my web browser and I'll type blog scaffolding. Blog, of course, is the name of our class, and scaffolding is the trigger word we just set in the routes file. And you can see our scaffolding utility is now being shown. I'll use it to create a new weblog entry. And while I'm here, I'll go ahead and create a second one. Okay, so that's it for scaffolding. So now what we need to do is replace this to-do list with our actual blog information. So let's go back to our controller. Since we're done with scaffolding, we'll remove it. And in our index function that we created last time, I'll retrieve the information from our database. CodeIgniter comes with a very full-featured abstracted database class that gives us a lot of different ways to run queries and get results. One of the ways is the active record pattern, which gives us a simplified means of retrieving, updating, and inserting information into the database with minimal syntax, and you'll see how convenient it is. Instead of this to-do list that we created, we'll change this index to query, so our query results can be shown here. And all we need to do to access our database records is to use the db-get function. And we'll use the table name as the parameter. There are additional parameters and methods you can use to limit or restrict the results, but using the get method like this will retrieve all records for us. So we'll leave it like that for now and pull all of the information out of the table. So let's go to our view file and generate our result so we can show it. Recall that we put our to-do list in a for each loop. I'll get rid of that list and change to-do to query and change item to row since that makes more sense for a database result. Our title field is here, and I'll copy that, change it to a couple paragraph tags, and we'll put our body field here. As a separator, I'll use a simple horizontal rule. Now if I reload the page, we see our weblog entries, the first entry and the second entry. So you can see how simple the syntax is to pull that information out of our database and display it. The next thing I want to do is add links within these two weblog entries so we can point to our comments page. Each of these links will need to contain the entry ID number corresponding to the entry so that when we display comments, they can be associated with that particular entry. To create that link, I could hard-code it here, but instead I'll use one of the helper files that CodeIgniter provides. Within the system folder, you'll notice one called helpers. Helpers are functions that allow you to do various types of things, like an array helper to allow you to work with array information, cookie helpers to assist you in setting cookies, date helpers to allow you to display dates in various ways, directory helpers that let you create and read folders, etc. The one I want to demonstrate now is the URL helper, and I'll also load the form helper while I'm at it since we're going to need to create a comment form. So let's go back to the controller and load the helpers. To load the helpers, I'll use the load class, which you'll recognize as the same we used to load our view file and earlier to load our scaffolding feature. Just like that, I've told it to load our URL and our form helpers. You can also use an array to load multiple helpers if you want to use this function only once. For now, we'll call it for each helper. Let's go back to our view file and create our link. Okay, I'm using the anchor function that's contained within the URL helper. This function lets us create links, and what I'll put as the first parameter is the destination we want our links to point to. Now we haven't created this comments function yet, but I know that I'm going to need a page to display comments, so I'll go ahead and point it to the destination. For what I'd like the link to say itself is comments. So now if I reload the page, you see our comment links here. And if I click one, we get a 404 page because we haven't created this function yet. But you can see that the URL is correct. We're going to the blog class and the comments function. The one thing that's missing from this URL is the ID number for the weblog entry itself. So let's add that. In the anchor function, let's simply tack on row ID. And there are a couple ways I could accomplish this, but this is pretty simple. Now if I reload the page and point to the comment again, you'll see that the ID number is now contained in the URL. I'll go back and click the second link so that you can see that the correct ID number is being sent with both links. So let's create our comment function. Going back to our controller, we'll create the function for comments. And let's test it with an echo statement. Now if we click the link, we'll see we're getting to our function correctly. So I'll proceed to make a view file for the comments. Just like we created a view file to display our blog entries, we need a comment view file to display the comments. So I'll make a new file. I'll name this one comment view. And I'll start by copying the information from our blog view file. I'll leave the title information and the heading information, but I'll delete the for each since we don't need that. Back to the controller, instead of our echo statement, I'll replace it with a copy of the code from our weblog function here. I'll change blog to comment, and instead of loading the blog view page, we want to load the comment view page. Now when we reload the page, you can see that we're now showing our comment view file. Okay, so now what I need to do is create a comment form so I can submit comments. Before I do that, I need to create a database table to hold our comment information. So let's go back to the database utility, and I'll create a new table called comments. And just like I did for the entries table, I'll make the ID field auto-incrementing. I need to add an entry ID field so each comment can be associated with a particular weblog entry. We also need a content field for our comments, and I'll call this body just like we did with our blog entries. Lastly, I'll add an author field. Just as with our entries, if I were building this application for a real site, I'd probably add a date field, a URL field, and a number of other things to make it robust. But for the tutorial, we'll keep it simple. Okay, let's create the comment form. Recall that we loaded the form helper, and I'd like to use that to assist in generating the comment form. In our comment view file, I'll add the form open function. This is a function within form helper, and this generates our opening form tag. And just like the URL helper, all we have to do is put in the path where we want it to end up, and it will create the rest. We're going to create this function called comment insert later to handle the comment submission, but we know this is where the form needs to point, so we'll put it there now. I also want to create a hidden form field, and I could hard code this, but the form helper has this function form hidden that allows us to do it easily, so I'll use that. The reason I need a hidden field is so our entry ID can be passed along to the comment submission function to be stored in the database. Remember that the third segment of our URI contains the ID number for a particular entry that the comments are associated with. So I'd like to put that information into a hidden field so when we submit the form, it will get added to the database. The name of the field is entry ID. If you'll recall from when we just created the comments table, we named it entry ID. And we need to put the actual value from the third segment of the URI. Thankfully, CodeIgniter comes with a class called the URI class that lets us work with our URI information. And that's it. Very simple. What I've told it is that I want to grab the third segment from the URI. Let's finish the form. I'll close it. And we need a text area for the body information. I'll add an input field for the author. And lastly, a submit button. Now I can reload the comment page and see that our form is being displayed. Let's look at the source code for a moment. You can see that the opening tag was created for us, and if you notice in the action, the full base path to our site was added to the URL, even though all we put in the form function were these two URI segments. We can see that our hidden field is here, and that it's correctly inserted the value from our entry ID. Our form, of course, isn't connected to anything yet, so if I were to click Submit, we get a 404 page because I've not defined this comment insert function yet, but it is going to the proper location. So let's go back to the controller and create a function to receive the form data. And we'll test this with an echo statement too. If I go back to the page and click Submit, you'll see we're getting our echo statement. Now let me show you how easy it is to receive information and insert it into the database. I'll use the active record method again, and this is incredibly simple. This will format the information so it can be inserted, and I'm throwing the entire post data array here. It'll automatically take the array keys and array values and format them so it's ready to be inserted with the query. It tells it which table to use, and that's it. One single line of code is all that's necessary to format the entire post array and throw it into the comment table of our database. One other thing I want to do is redirect people. I don't want the person submitting the comment ending up here at our comment insert function. I want them to be sent back to the comment viewing page so they can see the comment they submitted. The way I'll do that is by calling the redirect function. This function is one that's available in the URL helper that we loaded earlier. So I'll tell it to go to the blog comments function, and I'll tack on the entry ID from our post array. That way they end up back at the same entry they submitted comments for. And that's it, so let's try it. And it looks like everything worked. We're not seeing any results because we're not displaying any comments on the page at this point yet. We'll do that in a moment. But the fact that I didn't get an error message and we were returned to this page lets me know that the comment was successfully inserted into the database and we were then redirected back to this page. So now all we need to do is display our comment information on this page. We'll do that just like we did with our weblog entry information. You'll recall that we used the active record pattern to retrieve all the information from our entries table. I'll do the same thing with our comment table. So I'll copy and paste this line into our comment view function. And I'll change entries to comments so it's pointing to the right table. We do have one difference here. We want to limit this query to only show the comments that are associated with a particular entry. So let's use the where method. I want to limit it to the entry ID, and recall that the weblog entry is the third segment of our URI, so I'll use this here. Now we'll go to the comment view file and create a loop just like we did with our blog view. I'll copy that for each loop from our blog view file and put it in our comment view just above the form. I don't want this anchor tag in with the comments, so I'll drop it here out of our for each loop, and let's change it so it points back to the blog page. Within this query, there's no title, but we do have a body, and we also have an author. The last thing I want to do is make sure that we have results before looping through this for each. If there are no comments, without a conditional test, we could generate a PHP warning, and this is actually good practice to use anytime before processing query results. Tab that in to make it easier to read. Now I can reload the page, and we can see that it was showing our comment information. Let's submit another one. Oh, something's wrong with my redirect. Aha! I mistyped our field name. It should be entry_ID and not entry D. You were probably screaming at your web browser while you watched me type that in. So let's try that again. I'll do a third comment. There we go. Now this link should take us back to our main page, and it does. And let's try submitting a comment to the second entry. And there it is. In that short time, with some very simple code, we've created the basic framework for our blog. I should mention that if we were building this for a real site, we would obviously need to add a style sheet among other things. If we go back to the controller and look at the function that allows us to submit our comment, you'll remember that we just threw all of our post data in here. If this were a real site, we'd want to make sure and validate this information, and we'd need to make sure all the fields contain data, we'd filter it for security, and so forth. So there's still some work to be done to turn this into a real blog that you'd unleash upon the world, but in just 20 minutes we've created this rough framework for the blog without having to write a whole lot of code. That really shows the power of a framework like CodeIgniter because you don't have to write libraries from scratch. It provides you with all the features that you need so you can get right to work and accomplish a lot in the least amount of time. If I were to spend just another hour or two working on this, I could end up with a pretty full-featured blog. That's it. Thanks for watching.